I see two Rebeccas, by the way.
No, yes.
Are we officially starting?
Yeah, you want to start, Lisa?
Okay, sure. So welcome everyone to the first seminar series lecture of 2021. We're really pleased to have Asheesh Siddique here. Jeff's going to do the formal introduction, but before we get started, I just wanted to remind everyone of our next lecture coming up on the 11th of February at 11:30 a.m. We're going to have Ian Milligan from the University of Waterloo speaking as our Nugent lecturer on a very timely topic. He's going to asking, are we all digital historians now? Technology and historical practice. So just keep that in your calendar, and I will turn things over to Jeff.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. Welcome, everyone. I'm very happy to introduce Asheesh Siddique. Asheesh studied at Princeton and Oxford and did his PhD in history at Columbia, which he completed as long ago as 2016. He's had postdocs at UCLA and Penn State. And as of 2019, he has been an assistant professor of history at the University of Massachusetts in lovely Amherst. We were just talking about Western Massachusetts and my memories and his new experience of that part of the world. So he's reasonably close, and I wish we could have had him in person, but we're happy to have him here in this in the form of ether communications. He is already at just out of the blocks really in his career, the author of 5 peer-reviewed articles and chapters. The articles appearing in really first-rate outlets such as the Journal of Modern History, the William and Mary Quarterly, and the Journal of British Studies, which is the connection in which I first encountered his work in a serious way, and hence the invitation here to speak at Queen's. And I urge you all to go look at that article in the Journal of British Studies, as well as his other articles. It's excellent. His subjects broadly are the Atlantic world, empire, British Empire, colonization, the mechanisms of knowledge mobilization and governance, really. He's a student of the British Empire and its bureaucracy, its documents, its archives, as a means of understanding knowledge mobilization, interaction, and power wielding. And all of this is to be treated in a book in progress with the current title of Rule Through Paper, Archives and Language in the Governance of the British Empire. And what we have pre-circulated today, what he's pre-circulated today, is a chapter from that book, and I hope you've all had occasion to look at that. The title of which is Language and Sovereignty in the Early Modern British Empire. And so, as has been a practice with this new format, Asheesh is going to speak for 15 minutes or so, 20, and then we're going to open it up for reactions to his comments, but also hopefully for those of you who've read the paper. I'm going to ask you to use the chat function to alert me if you have a question, so I can keep a list that way. And the hand function, I find it more difficult to use. So if you can open your chat and use that as a mechanism for alerting me when you have a question for discussion, and you can do that at any time as he's speaking. I'll keep a list. And the only prioritization, I'll go back and forth between faculty and graduate students. Okay, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Asheesh.
Thank you so much, Jeff. It's really an honor to be here. So thank you so much to Lisa and Jeff for the kind invitation. It's really so nice to be here, especially having had a chance to really have the privilege to work with Jeff and Sandra and the entire editorial team at the Journal of British Studies. Which was just an absolutely wonderful experience. It's so great to have a chance to speak with you all today. And I wanted to, I'm gonna, since I did pre-circulate material, I'm gonna kind of keep my remarks a little bit more on the shorter side and place the chapter that I that I gave sort of in a broader context. And I always find that there's often so much to discuss that if I go on for too long, then we have a little less time for discussion. So I really want to kind of talk about what my book project, of which this is the second chapter, is all about, and maybe also show some of the ties between where this chapter sits within sort of the broader work that I do in the book about sort of the history of archives and language. So the book, which Jeff kindly gave the title of and gave such a kind introduction to, is kind of asks this question of a very, what you might think of as a very basic question. What kind of knowledge did the early modern British state define as necessary for the conduct of imperial government? And so I explored this question by explaining and looking at the relationship between various forms of imperial sovereignty, both that of the British state, really meaning the crown, and corporations, especially the East India Company. And I argue that there was a distinctively early modern answer that bureaucrats gave to this question of how states should be governed, and that this answer came to be deployed in different ways in the British Empire in the Atlantic world and the British Empire in India. And the answer said that present behavior could be understood and controlled by comparing it to how people had behaved in the past. In both the Atlantic world and the Asiatic context, I argue empires sought to govern British subjects in similar ways based on an administrative practice through which contemporary descriptions of human behavior were correlated with prescriptive and descriptive knowledge of how people had behaved in the past, which could be located in metropolitan archives. But empire was confronted with a problem in both contexts. How could non-English speaking peoples be governed? So in both the Atlantic world and in Asia, bureaucratic archives were understood to not provide guidance when it came to governing non-English speaking peoples, because they contained no information on their past behavior. And so administrators, I argue, in both contexts confronted a problem. If the archive was not a sufficient resource to figure out how to govern in relation to these peoples, then what was? And so in the book, I argue that imperial bureaucrats in the Atlantic world and then in Asia answered this question differently. And the reason why they answered this question differently lay ultimately in how they define the place of non-English speakers in terms of their own conception of imperial sovereignty. And so definitions of sovereignty, I'm arguing, manifested themselves, especially in the conduct of bureaucracy. And so in the Atlantic world, native peoples were construed to be outside the sovereign space of empire. And as a result, the British did not seek to get bureaucrats to learn about native cultures, especially to learn languages. But in India, the East India Company state increasingly conceived of itself as having sovereignty over native non-English speaking peoples. And this led over the course of the early and mid, and especially then in the late 18th century, to a growing sense of the imperative of constructing a parallel set of knowledge institutions based on learning indigenous local knowledge that could guide the administration of non-English speakers. But the effort to do this produced a political conflict within the bureaucratic apparatus of empire, because it challenged the primacy of metropolitan administrators who were committed to this early modern style of archival governance. and this produced a clash that led ultimately to the demise of the Metropolitan Archive as a governing instrument and the ascension of language as the defining form of modern imperial knowledge of especially the 19th and 20th century imperial state. And so I'll talk a little bit through some of the chapters of the book before as in closing to situate where this chapter sits in relation to. So the chapter that precedes the one that I circulated is tentatively called "Animating the Imperial Body," and it explains the entanglement of archives, paper, and imperial sovereignty in early modern imperial thought, and especially archives and the circulation of documents as a mode of governing the subjects of the crown or crown-centered bodies. And I've published some of this argument, notably last year in the Journal of British Studies, in an article on the relationship between archives, documents, and ideas of constitutionalism in the early modern British Atlantic world. And in the book, I build upon that argument and extend the exploration to show how a parallel regime of using documents and archives to enforce administrative priorities developed within the context of the East India Company's rule in Asia. And this sort of regime of governance by archives, I argue, is very much the result of the outgrowth of the extension of a particular form of early modern political knowledge that initially really develops within the English administrative state, especially in the 16th century, into imperial space. And so I build especially on the work of scholars like Noah Millstone and Nick Popper and many others who have sort of begun to explore the nature of the documentary regime of the early modern English state and show how many of the ideas of political expertise tied to writing and the control of writing came to be laminated onto the practice of imperial government. Chapter 2, which is the chapter which you read, looks at how language was deployed in the Americas and India and why this was structured in terms of how Native peoples were construed in relation to this constellation of imperial sovereignty. And since I said since you read the whole thing, or there was a lot to say about that, I will perhaps say a little bit less about that. But my one of the things that I argue is that ideas of whether language was an important part of what bureaucrats thought they needed to know in order to govern was very much tied to an understanding of where non-English speaking people sat in relation to conceptions of imperial sovereignty. And as I argue in the chapter that was circulated in the Atlantic world and then in British Asia, by the time that the monarchical government, especially royal administrators, were in charge in the Americas, one could argue, especially beforehand, that there were some very different ideas of where Native peoples sat. That language was kind of really a kind of a minor discourse of what administrators were conceived to need to know. And this was sort of tied to the idea that, well, Native peoples, Indians, were not part of the compass of subjects of the crown, and therefore understood to be something like an external an external force that could be related to based on sort of the norms of European diplomacy as a kind of external state, but that in India these ideas were somewhat more complicated because of the ways in which the East India Company was conceiving itself, conceiving of its own sovereignty in relation to Indian peoples in India. And that explains why there was a greater interest in the context of company bureaucracy in Indian languages. And so that's sort of what I look at in the chapter that I circulated. And so in the later parts of the book, in the last two chapters, I show how these two ideas of kind of archival government and linguistic attuned government, let's call it maybe linguistic government, really sort of the contrast between them really came to be heightened in the late 18th century, especially after the East India Company became the so-called Diwan of Bengal and attained a in the context of conquest, attained the title of essentially the landed ruler over Bengal in the aftermath of the wars of 1757 and 1760 between the company and the Mughal Empire. And I argue that the result of this, at which point the company attained a landed title and sovereignty over native peoples, meant that bureaucrats within the company began to argue more robustly for the idea that metropolitan archives were, in fact, not adequate at all to governing Indians in India, and that what was needed was a kind of a parallel corpus of written texts and a parallel set of things that bureaucrats needed to know, especially language, that were explicitly conceptualized as not to be found in bureaucratic archives because these archives could not govern non-English speaking peoples. And so I sort of point toward this argument a little bit in the material that I circulated in my discussion of William Jones, who is very much one of the people who really articulates this idea that there has to be a different kind of archive that's not the Metropolitan Archive in terms of thinking about how how Indians in India ought to be governed. And then the book ends in perhaps what I think of now as one, but perhaps it will become more, of a chapter that shows why these two ideas of kind of archival-based governance and then linguistic-based governance came to really clash toward the end of the 18th century. And why, in the end, as I argue, language kind of won as a central epistemology of modern imperial rule. And I look at this in part by tracking how archives came gradually from the 1780s, 1790s, and then into the early 1800s to come to be seen as less relevant to the practice of administration, ultimately leading by the 1810s, 1820s, and then in the 1830s to their transformation from the record offices that were in control of bureaucrats to something like the archives that we know today, public record offices, places where historians could go and gather documentary evidence and documentary materials, in part because the state had increasingly become less interested in controlling these archives and using them as tools and resources for government. And I track this in part by looking both at how the what was called the State Paper Office, which was kind of the central archive of royal government, and then kind of became this sort of in the 1790s the sort of archive of the state writ large. Came to ultimately be transformed into the PRO, the Public Records Office, which is the predecessor to to the National Archives, to Kew, as many of you perhaps have, an archive that many of us know very well. And something similar that happens in the context of the East India Company records, where those archives and those records increasingly come to be thought as ornaments to be displayed, rather than things that need to be read and then used as tools of government, even before the kind of the end of the company, or the transformation of the company in the late 19th and in the mid and late 19th century, into something that was really quite different from its early modern character. And so in sum, the book kind of really is an effort to track the relationship between both a kind of a structural change in the nature of empire, in terms of systems of knowledge. And so, as you hear me talking, my goal when the book is finally out is to kind of clarify what this argument has to say about some of the really big questions in British imperial history, especially questions of, well, what is the relationship between the so-called First British Empire and the Second British Empire? What actually happened that made the British Empire so-called modern by, let's say, the 19th and 20th centuries? And what really did it mean to say that there was an early modern British Empire? Kind of what did early modernity really mean in that context? And my argument is that it in part had to do with a particular conception of the knowledge regime thought of as requisite for rule. And so I think with that, I'm going to stop, and we can maybe have a discussion.
Jeff, you're muted.
Oh, sorry, yes, thank you. Perils of this format. That was a lucid and interesting, intriguing discussion of the broader project situated in this chapter. So I'm going to open it up. As I said at the beginning, I prefer if you use the chat, if you can, to pose a question rather than the hand function, but I'll try to keep my eye on the hands too. So who would like to start us off? Sean Mars.
Oh, thank you very much. This is really interesting. I have a question because I'm really intrigued by the notion of governing through archives. And I'm really curious how that relates to sort of an Enlightenment ideal of encyclopedic knowledge and sort of gathering as much information as possible, and sort of the early modern attempts to create an information state.
So absolutely. Thank you so much, Sean, for this question. And I think that's actually one of the big arguments, is that I think that there was a kind of a particular information state that that as many as so many really wonderful scholars have looked at for the early modern period, both within sort of the context of the early modern English state, thinking of especially Nick Popper and Noah Millstone's work, and Elizabeth Yale's work, and then in the broader context of European states, thinking of Jake Soul's work, Randy Head's work, Maria Pia Donato, many other people who have looked at this, as well as of course the broader work on on humanist knowledge practices that so many have been working on. I think that in a lot of ways there are immense parallels between this kind of encyclopedic knowledge regime and the so-called Enlightenment one. And I mean, although I'm not sure that this is an argument that I think can exactly be made in the book, it may take the book a bit in a bit of a different direction than what than what it really can do. I think that in part there has been a whole argument in like Enlightenment scholarship about both what's the relationship between sort of the how should I put it, sort of the high enlightenment of ideas, and not just the kind of the low enlightenment that so many scholars, especially Bob Darnton, looked at, kind of the Grub Street hacks, but also not just the high enlightenment of ideas, but also kind of this high enlightenment of what you might call the long history of humanist practice, like archiving, indexing, collecting manuscripts, circulating them. And I think that one argument that could be made is that a lot of those kind of practices of circulation and paperwork, for which is a term that I sometimes use, really show kind of a point to something that we often don't perhaps talk about quite as much, but the traffic between intellectuals and the state in the early modern period, including the early modern English state. I mean, so many of the so-called famous people, the great men of let's say even the Scottish Enlightenment, were also bureaucrats. David Hume was a diplomatic secretary for a while, as was Adam Ferguson. Adam Smith was a customs administrator. I mean, everywhere you look, there was an intense traffic between bureaucracy and the so-called world of ideas. And of course, all of these figures were also enmeshed in what arguably was the other great, beyond, say, the state and the church, the other great bureaucracy of the early modern period, which was the university. And as scholars such as William Clark have shown, the world of the early modern university is a place where practices of paperwork and archiving and this relationship between sort of the production of ideas and the kind of the grubby work of handling documents was very much enmeshed. So that's kind of maybe a preliminary answer to your question.
Okay, thank you, Sean. Jeff McNairn.
Oh, thanks, Asheesh. After Sean's intellectual question, I attempted to withdraw my slightly less intellectual question. The broader project on government and archives and knowledge practices and systems and all that sounds fascinating. So I was really interested in this. But I had a slightly narrower question about this chapter. And as someone who studies 18th and 19th century Canada, the laziest thing to do is to say, what about Canada? So I'm going to be lazy and I'm going to, the colonial cringe, here it comes. You use the word Atlantic, and I think you just mean the 13 colonies. The stuff on the Caribbean is kind of, you show, I think, convincingly that it doesn't really fit. And then I was like, well, Nova Scotia is part of the British Empire from 1713, and I think, could be added. And then I'm like, there's one reference to the Hudson's Bay Company. And there's a lot of recent scholarship on the Hudson's Bay Company that I think draws on the scholarship that you're drawing on about the East India Company, and might trouble the distinction you draw between sort of trade and diplomacy on the one side and sovereignty on the other. That seems a bit of a dichotomy, and I wonder if the HBC wouldn't, and its practices wouldn't trouble that dichotomy. And then at the very end of your period, there's Quebec. And there, we have non-English speakers. We don't have, right? And we have a parallel legal system, and we have jurors, and we have archives that suddenly have to be bilingual, and newspapers, and concerns about administration and education, and a bilingual library to build a bilingual archive. So so that's my sort of, colonial cringe Canadianist comment. But I wonder if it maybe wouldn't be a way of thinking about not aligning non-English with Indigenous and aligning Atlantic with 13 colonies.
Yes, this is such a great, this is fantastic. And I I absolutely plead guilty to having done that illusion, and I, I have two things to say. Absolutely, you are right, and if and I have to admit that I wrote this chapter based on materials that I had collected in a pre-COVID world, and one of my goals in a post-COVID world that may hopefully, knock on wood, actually enable a return to the archives is to look precisely at that at the question that you raise, and the slightly more combative answer, which I realize that I need to do more work to both A, make explicit, and B, to possibly convince you of, is that I think that there are I think that there's a bigger argument that that will need to be sort of centered more in the manuscript about the extent to about the relationship between what between sort of administrative knowledge and attention to the local circumstances and the particularities of particular colonies, and in concepts of empire-wide norms, in empire-wide norms and practices, which is to say that Quebec absolutely presents a problem for the extent to which I've kind of said, well, there was, in so many words, I mean, I've said there was a universal empire-wide set of ideas that, or set of practices in which, basically a kind of a binary was constructed. And I think that I need to do more work to answer, to answer sort of your, to answer your, I think very much on point critique. I mean, also to address the issue of, as you point out, not just the question of the indigenous, but also just non-English speakers within the empire. I mean, I think I probably gloss her work at some point. I mean, as Hannah Mueller has shown, I mean, subjectivity in this period is a very complicated idea, and it especially in an imperial context, and it allows people to make a variety of different claims that in some ways trouble my all too neat, perhaps, equation of sort of language and subjectivity in this chapter. And I think I need to do a little bit more work to clarify things precisely on the line that you absolutely correctly point out.
The other alternative is just to say this is predominantly about indigenous languages in the 13 colonies. I have no problem with that. To just,
right.
We all join you in hoping we're back in the archive as soon as possible.
Right.
But I think it's a way of. I'm less concerned with making the project bigger and more just maybe troubling some of those illusions.
Yes.
Just more easily deal with that. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. Joe Bersato.
Just wanted to say thanks again for your talk. That was really enlightening. I really appreciate it. Question is sort of similar to what Jeff just asked. You answered a little bit of it already, but I'm curious about the relationship between, especially in the Atlantic context, center and periphery in this case. I mean, it seems like there's not as much, there's a certain amount of influence from the colonies themselves, since the center wants certain things and then the colonists want other things. They've got different ideas about what should be done with property and how to dispossess indigenous peoples. So I'm curious if you have some thoughts about that and how, Yeah, and how and are there records from the colonies that you might be looking at? It maybe in another chapter. I mean, it was a really great chapter. I really enjoyed reading it. I'm just curious if there's sort of more influence on these the shift in the language policy based on the things that are going on in the colonies in this period. Thank you.
Thank you. So that, again, this is a really important question, and one that again points to one of the is as in Jeffrey's question beforehand, points to I think the way that the project kind of is really about the view of empire from the center. And I've actually gotten this question about this chapter about the Indian material. I mean, the exact same questions that you've just raised. What about, I mean, in that context, it's a little bit less about settlers per se than bureaucrats, say company bureaucrats on the ground. Whether they're settlers is I guess, I suppose, a complicated question. But my first answer is that I think that that this project, as it currently as it currently stands, I don't have the capacity to really look at settlers per se, just because it's such a huge, I mean, it's just like a huge task. But my sense is that, and partly what, I can't remember if there's a, if I make the reference in the chapter or not, but I do think that by the, I do think that there is a point to be made about the extent to which, at least by the in North America, in the 13 colonies by the Revolutionary period, certain ideas about this kind of very rigid distinction of Native peoples as not being part of the sort of the compass of, in that case, the nascent revolutionary state, have really hardened, and this is certainly seen in the Declaration of Independence, in the way that Native peoples are really, in a very interesting way, kind of excoriated as the allies of the monarchy, and as the what does Jefferson call them? Something like the I can't remember if I have a reference in the title, but something like that, some really nasty stuff about them being like the worst, most dangerous, most uncouth people ever known to man, or something like that. And I think that reflects in some ways the odd way in which there is clearly a there's something to be said about how settler colonists in the North Atlantic world, especially in the 13 colonies, come to, I think, both play around a little bit with this idea of Native peoples as not part of the empire, and then engrafted upon a kind of very nascent idea of where they will sit in relation to the new American state, which is something that I'm thinking about looking at a little bit in the final chapter of the book, in terms of sort of the early ideas of, say, tribal sovereignty in the and sort of the westward expansion in the context of sort of the early American state. But yeah, I mean, I do think that at least in this chapter, it is really about what bureaucrats in London are thinking, and in that sense, I mean, my argument would be that I don't think that settler ideas are really paramount, because they're thinking with very metropolitan early modern ideas of sovereignty that that are very much present in their own minds, and that also they have so, I mean, you know, it's hard to you know, I mean, so many of them really just have, you know, a lot of the people sitting at the board of trade have just never been to America. I mean, they just have no idea really what they're governing per se. I mean, it's all what they read and you know, in these archives. And so yeah, I mean, you know, actually that has to be kind of, I think, maybe more clearly articulated in this chapter. But thank you.
Okay, excellent. So queue is forming. Just a reminder to people, if you jumped on late, open up your chat and toss a message to me if you have a question. But next is Stephen Maynard.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Your project, as I read it and listened to you describe it to us today, really puts me in mind of the work of Patrick Joyce on archives, on record offices, on the post office, in filing barrage, as he calls it. And I'm wondering whether he's someone whose work you find useful, and if so, how your ideas about archival governance differ from his or elaborate on his.
Thank you so much for that question. I mean, so I really am interested in Joyce's project, and I mean, in some sense, partly one of my questions for Joyce would be, I always find, I mean, I think Patrick Joyce is one of the most consistently interesting and provocative historians, not just of Britain, but just working today. I mean, I think his work is amazing. But one of the questions that I always have when I read him is about, you know, insofar as one is kind of doing this interrogation of liberalism via various kind of modalities, including by looking at practices of, you know, practices of paperwork and filing, which is, I mean, I guess you're probably thinking of the same chapter in
States of Freedom.
Exactly, States of Freedom, as I am, are those practices actually, are those practices of filing that he discusses actually particular to liberal government, or are they part of a much longer history wherein early modern ideas of filing and documentary sort of sorting and classification simply continue long past the supposed end of the early modern period into times when other forms and ideas of and other ideologies of government are present. And so my question for Joyce would be that I'm not sure that the paperwork as he conceives it in his work is actually particular to liberal government at all. I mean, I kind of think of it as actually a way in which a lot of the ideas of, well, if you have documents, you need some kind of order of classification to put them in, are part of this longer history. And there is a way that I always find in Joyce's work that we kind of have liberalism and we have the 19th century, but it's like always just the 19th century as this kind of this umbrella period without much kind of detailed periodization within it, if you get what I mean. It's sort of like, well, is it the liberal state before the Reform Act or after the Reform Act or the Gladstonian period, or, you know, sort of when are these practices, are they coming into, is the argument in part that they're coming into being at this point? Because that I take a little bit of issue with, or is it that they maybe have different meanings under a new ideology of government? So I find Joyce's work very interesting, and I'm thinking that possibly at the end of the book, in the last chapter, where I look at how archives, kind of, as I was glossing a little bit in the earlier part of the talk, sort of go from being these centers where bureaucrats are working to places where the public and historians are going. I'm thinking of possibly trying to engage maybe little bit obliquely with Joyce's argument about that, about kind of the specificities of when this new documentary regime comes into being and why. So does that maybe?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, next up, Michael Borsk.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Asheesh, for delivering this wonderful paper again. And in full disclosure, I got to hear your Chicago version of this too.
Oh.
So it's great to see kind of how it's progressed, and I think it's wonderful. I had a question on another Patrick who was sort of living in my head, Patrick Wolf. And in thinking about these conversations about language and the way that it's used in imperial governance or approached as a problem of imperial governance, I couldn't help but hear his voice say, is it as simple as the fact that we don't need to learn the language of the people we intend to eliminate? And is this as much about understandings of people as it is about intentions for land differences? You don't need to tax a people you don't govern, and vice versa. So I was curious how that political economy around property and land factors into this really rich conversation about linguistics you want to have.
Yeah, I mean, the way that you just put it is I think actually probably something that I should really kind of say in a lot of ways explicitly in this, in the chapter and then in the book. I mean, I think that absolutely there is this, there is this sense that, well, the limits of, I mean, insofar as Indians cannot be part of the British Empire in the sense that if they were, they would have to, acknowledge that they are under the sovereignty of the British Crown, but that would mean that they would have to give up their sovereignty to their own forms of political leadership. It is kind of my argument, and maybe this should be something that I say in a much more bolder terms, is that you kind of have to eliminate that very crucial part of what it means to be a subject in order to become this kind of subject. And largely speaking, Native peoples do not, in the Atlantic world, take that up. And the company presents a kind of a different problem, in part because it assumes, or is thought to assume, widely thought to assume, this kind of native sovereignty within India, which within Bengal, which allows it to sort of say, if you were a subject of the Mughal Empire, well, yes, it is actually possible for you to be a subject of this kind of complicated company state. And yeah, I mean, in the context of, and certainly in the context of South Asia, I mean, there is no real idea that that we, the East India Company, or could come in and just do what the British do in North America, which is wage war and kill lots of people, with the intent of either genocide or simply just pushing pushing Native peoples off their land. In the context of Bengal, in the context of South Asia, that is not that's not really conceived. It's not possible because the company's kind of comparative bureaucratic presence in South Asia is just so much smaller than the British states in the Americas. And just as a kind of aside, I mean, the Caribbean, which presents a bit of a different problem, because I think I maybe dropped this in, and the amount that the indigenous population of that by the 18th century has been so decimated by previous waves of European colonization that the British kind of don't quite encounter the same problem there.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Andrew Jangel.
Hi, thank you for that great talk. I'm struggling a little to formulate my questions, so apologies in advance if it doesn't make much sense. But I work on early modern France, and if I were to take this kind of framework, to invoke the same intellectual laziness, that Jeff McNairn invoked before, though his was not intellectual lazy, but intellectually lazy. But if I were to take this framework and think about it in terms of, my own field, this sort of movement from, archival based knowledge to emphasizing language would map onto something like this world of, feudal knowledge of registers and, when was this first written down and things like that, to the sort of post-revolutionary world of, written codified law, where people had to have the language to understand the law rather than just their own traditions and registers. And is that something like what's going on here?
Yes, and I think that the law part is actually very crucial and important, particularly when it comes to the question of the company, because the impetus, and I discussed this somewhat toward the end of the paper, but it probably is something that I really center a little bit more in the book, is that the company, and especially the company really understands itself to be in part the administrator of for lack of a term, Indian law over Indians. And so this is why so much of the linguistic endeavor, as seen in the collection of texts by company officials in projects of translation of Indian texts into English so that English administrators can use them, centers upon the translation of Mughal and other Indian legal texts, and why a figure like William Jones, who I talk about a little bit toward the end of the chapter, is such a kind of a force for pushing the translation project within the company. I mean, Jones is kind of usually engrafted within the historiography as sort of like the founder of Orientalism, but he was a lawyer, and he was thinking especially I think in the ways that he served as a company bureaucrat, a great deal about law as the centerpiece for this. And certainly, I mean, my argument kind of picks up in a lot of ways on Robert Travers's argument about the importance of a so-called ancient Mughal constitution or ancient Indian constitution, which British administrators sought to invent, really, out of in the same way that they in a lot of ways invented a kind of ancient constitution within England and Britain itself for kind of domestic administration. And I think, I mean, a lot of my argument, although I think the engagement with Travers's work in this chapter is a little bit weak, is very much kind of picking up, and I'm very much thinking with his work on that.
Okay, could I just follow up quickly? So I was sort of dwelling on the analysis of Jones when I was thinking of this question, and I mean, in the Jones sort of the brief discussion here, the question of the archive and language are, I mean, they're not actually that separate in a sense, because language is how you're accessing these ancient records in the archive, but the full move to the sort of linguistic, knowledge regime that you are invoking in the introduction would seem to almost be leaving behind the archive and the sort of the written records and the ancient knowledge. So, I mean, Jones seems almost somewhat transitional in that regard here.
Yeah, and you know, one of the problems with the ways that I think that this chapter is currently written, though I'm trying to fix it in the book, is that I think that there is a that to some extent I give an impression that it's like, you know, like the alternative between the archive and the linguistic is in some ways like an alternative between the past and a kind of a non-history oriented form of knowledge. And that's not true at all. I mean, it's just a kind of it's a different idea of what the relevant history and what the relevant archive is. And I, as I'm revising and writing, need to kind of make that much clearer, because I mean, I mean, in some ways it's really the argument that there's a different kind of history that is relevant for governing this people. It's just that that history is not the history that we find in, you know, the Tower of London and the State Paper Office. It's this other history that we, you know, this other history based on an archive that we make up by, you know, talking to a lot of Brahmins and then just like collecting a lot of texts and translating them in ways that we think will be useful or make sense.
Thank you. All right, great project. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, Sanya.
Hi, Asheesh. So I also have gotten to see this paper in 2 variants, and now my question actually kind of connects to Andrew's and to the earlier discussion about the kind of like metropolitan provincial connection. And so I'm really interested, but definitely know very little about legal regimes in the territory of British India. But I understand that this chapter really focuses on the way that metropolitan actors perceive the on the ground situation. And I think that's like very clear with Jones and how he sees the relationship between like language acquisition and legal knowledge. But given that the situation on the ground is like a lot more complicated, there is no unified body of law, and there is no single legal regime. Are there problems when on the ground administrators run into these other regimes by following this sort of approach? And does that ever influence the way that this regime of language develops? I guess I know it's like a big task to take on, but would that peripheral influence change the way that this language regime develops, or even the way that it's applied in different colonies and things like that?
I mean, definitely. I think there is some, I mean, I have done some research on this, and it really bears out the point that you make about kind of the limits of the metropolitan perspective when it comes to sort of looking at this. But I've done just a bit of it, which really in the case of India really involves kind of looking at, you know, all of the residency files in you know, in Asian and African studies, and it really, I think, I mean, it bears out the extent to which the divergence between you know, metropolitan ideas of what the local is, that I think are very familiar from the context of the Atlantic world, are not just familiar, are not just in many ways also familiar in the context of British Asia, but also augmented by the fact that the transfer of information between these two sites well into the late 18th century is just absolutely ridiculously long. I mean, it takes like a year. I mean, for letters, including well into the later part of the 18th century, for information to travel between these two sites. And so oftentimes what the company's court of directors is commenting on when it's receiving a letter from, the Bengal presidency is like, I mean, stuff that happened a year ago, and so I think that I mean, it is absolutely the case that there is just a colossal sense of, well, people are, and this is a kind of a point that I make a little bit in the JBS article, and then in the first chapter of the book. I mean, bureaucrats are trained to say what they think people who employ them want them to hear, and so when they reply to something like a questionnaire, I mean, they're performing this kind of a work of showing compliance, and it's not really this thing where it is this thing where they're both in providing like data and empirical information, but it's done within this particular epistemic context in which deference and obedience are very important things to be able to perform. And that is very much the case in the context of the company itself, though I think also magnified by the problems of distance and the fact that, I mean, just a lot of the people who are, who are sitting at the court of directors and who are really influential within the context of the, I think it's important, of course, to say, right, in the context of the company's metropolitan governance and influential in that regard, are people who are not who are not per se experts on India, but really people who are shareholders within a joint stock company and who are in this for financial gain, and who see all of these transformations in that context. So I think that's a very important part of this. And I mean, these are all things that, like, in the introduction of the book, I'm trying to, my introduction to the book is currently just like a lot of notes, but I'm trying to sort of spell out. And so absolutely, it's really important to make those things, those things clear.
Okay, Max Hammond.
Hi, thanks. Can you hear me there? Yeah, thanks very much. I really enjoyed the talk. Big pictures, bring lots of things together. It's great to see that. I also want to. I'm also a Canadian historian, so I want to return to some of the questions that have been raised earlier. I wanted to know basically, why is it necessary for you to make this distinction between the empire in America and the empire in India? And I guess I just, is there a real reason why you need to make that so clear difference between how imperial knowledge is collected or archived in these two different places? And I'm thinking about, I guess I'm wondering a little bit more why you need to make such a clear sense that the indigenous peoples are not incorporated into the imperial state or into the imperial subjecthood in the Americas. And if we look at the William Johnson, the Treaty of Niagara, we see that there is collaboration. There are efforts to bring in subjects. As Jeff McNairn mentioned earlier, that the work in the Hudson's Bay Company up north, they're bringing in Pierre Esprit Radisson to access the indigenous trade networks. And there's a recent book by Heidi Bohaker, which talks about governance and laws, and the ways in which both French and British governments are trying to come to terms with indigenous forms of government. And so I guess I wonder why the distinction between these two regions needs to be so clear. Can you speak to that a little bit?
So, I mean, absolutely. I mean, excellent question. And I think the answer is that I think that there is a, and this is something that is not really clear from the chapter, and I have to think a little bit about what exactly I need to say about it in the context of the book, that I do think that there is a distinction, which I have not fully certainly not clarified in this chapter, between the the kind of the corporate constitution of the English presence in India, which is really transacted through a corporate structure of early modern governance that does have that has a lot of parallels to that of the kind of the crown-centered architecture that is prevalent within the Atlantic world, but is also in many respects in many respects very different in ways that I think that I need to clarify in somewhat greater detail in the book and in the project. Warren Hastings as Governor General has some of the same functions that a governor or a governor general in the Atlantic world would have, but he also has these other kinds of complicated recognitions by Native peoples as kind of a direct authority over them. Clive similarly is thought of as a kind of is kind of thought of as a conqueror. The Diwan has a particular kind of status and understanding, and it's not quite clear that there's ever exactly a parallel to it within North America. And so I think a lot of the challenge of the book is to sort of try to traffic between the question of what was empire-wide and what was sort of common to different spaces, as well as attending to the particularities of context and what was different. And I think one of the challenges that I face in this book, and that I think I need to do a lot more work on in this chapter, as well as just in the book more generally, is to really kind of clarify what that is. But I do think, there's this constant tension between the fact that there are, if you want to say trans-imperial or cross-imperial ideas and practices, but also just these very different kind of contexts, as well as kind of not exactly similar forms of sovereignty that are working. Even corporate sovereignty in this 18th century, particularly in the 18th century period, but just in the early modern period more generally, is also not a static concept, and it's something that's constantly being worked out, in part because of its dependency over the course of this very long early modern period, not just on crown charters, but then certainly by the 18th century in the case of the company, also on parliamentary charters, which are also changing in all kinds of ways. So it's a complicated problem, and I think as the book kind of approaches a state of greater coherence, this is something that I need to address in a detailed way.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to jump in with a comment and a question, but I think we'll have a little bit more time if there's any more questions from the group. And even if you've already asked a question, you have a follow-up, you can toss that in the chat too. I think we'll have about 2 more minutes. But I wanted to jump in first with just a comment. I don't know if you've been listening to Mark Goldie's Carlisle lectures. He's just giving them now at Oxford, and they're available online. This is for the group. Actually. I've been promoting to my own students. They're about Locke's time at the Board of Trade, and they're just ingenious because he's dug up all sorts of interesting interactions between Locke and sort of figures on the colonial periphery. And what emerges from that, and it's kind of builds on the point you made earlier about how many of the philosophers and the 18th century kind of figures we think of as central to the Enlightenment, particularly in Scotland and England, were involved in empire. And Locke is an example of this, of course. But what emerges from it is just how powerful the Board of Trade was in these years, and how powerful Locke was on the Board of Trade, and how he was understood to be a powerful figure by people you would not expect to have known this or to have, and his own political theory was often used by settlers sort of to challenge the decisions of the Board of Trade. So there's this fascinating kind of way in which Locke's ideas are being tested in a colonial setting and found wanting by many participants. But it does strike me as I thought about that what you're kind of suggesting in your own work is that this is a powerful, but in some sense closed communication circle, and that the various agents of empire understood the need to sort of break this circuit and to get out of it in some sense. And so, I mean, I think there's an interesting kind of implication your work poses to his, and it might be interesting to pick up on. He's writing a book on the subject. But my question was a little bit more basic, and that is, as regards language, what's missing here is any sense that any of these imperial governors really thought that the use of English as a civilizing or assimilation technique. You mentioned a sort of imperialism in the British Isles at one point as a kind of model for this. Well, in Ireland and Wales and Scotland, as you know, there is kind of often a desire, at least, an aspiration to use English as a way of absorbing colonies and assimilating them. Often this was about ensuring that settlers in Ireland didn't kind of, quote, go native, and that they maintained their English. And so it wasn't exactly about educating Gaelic speakers in English often, but there was a kind of slow process over many more centuries, of course, and with much more sort of complicated migration and plantation patterns in Scotland and in Ireland, where English becomes a kind of ruling language. And of course, there are circumstances in which, I know better the North American situation, where English becomes something that's taught as a way of attempting to integrate Native Americans into a polity. Obviously, this happens eventually in India, but could you speak to that? Why you don't address that, or how you would tell that story alongside the story you're telling, which is about acquiring the languages necessary to
So I intend to make that point in the book, and it does need to be there. And I think that actually that is a very important part of this. I think not just this chapter, but kind of the overall problem, particularly as it extends into kind of the later 18th century. So absolutely, I mean, I think it is really notable that I mean, there isn't this idea or this program of we're going to just, make everybody speak English. I mean, there are kind of these one-off, projects. I guess I'm blanking, but I guess it's like, I mean, I was just thinking of Ebenezer Wheelock's. I mean, it's missionaries who think of this as in certainly in North America as this possible project, but it's not the state that does this or spends much time. And then in the context of India, actually the reverse happens, because the project eventually becomes, by the time that and this is all kind of something I talk about a little bit later in the book, by the time that Hastings is thinking about starting like a language institution and thinking, and he has all of these sort of dialogues with Oxford about, well, can you establish like, a place of Oriental, like professorships of Oriental studies, and the eventual founding of, what is known, as Haileybury College, which is sort of the place where the modern, that is to say that kind of the 19th century company civil service goes to get training, is in fact kind of the opposite, which is that not only are we not going to kind of mass anglicize Indians in India, we, British people, British civil servants are going to try to learn the Indian languages in a very, in not just kind of the more ad hoc ways of like, okay, we're just going to pay somebody to like translate a dictionary or something, but we're going to have a school where you're going to go and you're going to study Hindi or Marathi and Sanskrit and Bengali, and we're going to have this sort of training apparatus. And I think that that is a very, I think it's a very important part of this entire constellation, where it isn't really about, I mean, it isn't about mass Anglicization at all, but rather this kind of, you know, project of sort of appropriating. I mean, it depends how I, you know, this isn't a very precise way of characterizing it, but kind of appropriating the native within the kind of the political structure of empire, rather than, you know, rather than kind of the reverse, which is I would think perhaps a contrast to the way that sort of the modern American state, most notably, you know, relates to first peoples in the 19th and 20th century, where there is kind of, no, we're going to kind of try to shove you into our settler colonial framework.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's really a fascinating implication of what you're doing, because, of course, what winds up happening is that English does become this great legacy of the empire. It becomes the global language almost. And so, if there's any marker of you know, the remnants of this empire and its cultural influence, it is in language. So how that happens, and when that, particularly in India, when that flips, it would be an interesting kind of thing to consider, maybe in a coda or an epilogue.
Yes.
All right. Are there any other follow-up questions from the group, or we're basically at the end of our time? But I think we can take one more question. And anything else that you'd like to add as you go over these questions, or?
Well, I just want to say thank you all so much for your time and your questions and your engagement and your suggestions. I mean, this was just amazingly helpful, and I'm so grateful to everybody for not just for taking the time to come today, but also taking the time to read and engage. I'm really grateful for not just the invitation, but just this wonderful conversation that has given me so much to think about, and in so many ideas to work with. I really am grateful to everyone for your questions and your ideas and your comments.
Well, thank you for an excellent paper. And actually, we have one, having almost wrapped up, Alex has jumped in with a question. So Alex Martinborough.
Yeah, sorry to jump in like right at the end as things are wrapping up. I had a question about the relationship between different types of constitutions and different types of writing and archiving. As you kind of get towards the end of the chapter, you get to knowing the English Constitution requires some type of writing and common law stuff. So how are you kind of working through or thinking about the paper nature of this unwritten constitution and moving between an imperial constitution that doesn't really exist, in that it's not anywhere like codified, written down or anything, but nonetheless applies to various parts of empire, the English Constitution, and is it an English Constitution, a British Constitution, or something else entirely? And the colonial constitutions, which at this point are sometimes charters, sometimes sometimes not, and what is the kind of constellation there mapped onto your two kind of modes, I guess, of thinking about the empire? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, this is one of the things that I that is also something that I'm thinking through in the book, a little bit more in the first chapter on archives. But you know, I think one of the, and I have a kind of another very early stage future project about kind of a history of constitutional ideas in the context of the American one. And in that way, in that particular project, I've been doing I've been doing some work and have a draft paper that I've written about sort of ideas of exactly what it would mean to say that there is a, you know, that there was kind of an archivally oriented constitution. And in one of the things that it seems to be very interesting in the end of that happens, at least at the end of the 18th century in the context of American independence, is that there is this sort of moment in which, at least as I see it, a lot of the kind of framers, founding fathers sorts of people are explicitly saying that what makes the American Constitution so different and new, and then different from the English Constitution, and sometimes it's the English Constitution, sometimes it's the British Constitution. Very, very interesting point is the fact that it is codified within one document, and that you don't have to go to the archives, specifically that you don't have to go to state papers to figure out what it is. And eventually, and this sort of tracks a little bit with what Jonathan Gannap has argued in a recent book on the subject, points to the way in which kind of later in the early Republic, there is an idea of what Gannap kind of characterizes as an archival constitution, that there is this idea, which by what he means is that the idea that the US Constitution comes to be fixed, but it's a very different kind of an archive than the kind of archive that I have argued is so relevant to constitutional thinking in the early modern period. And I kind of have a paper that I've been working on which tries to point that out, and I maybe at some point I will finish it. But yeah, I think this is a really I mean, this is a very important part of it, and you know, to go kind of very, I guess, very briefly to the kind of the common law question. I mean, there is this way in which there's this, you know, tension between the idea, and this is something that I also have been thinking about you know, saying that, you know, constitutional ideas are in parts the result of the speech, you know, for lack of a better term, of the sovereign, versus saying that a constitution is either a kind of a reflection of natural rights that cannot be reduced to their expression just in language per se. And I'm not sure how that might fit into this book. What remains to be seen, but it's definitely something that I continue to, you know, have been thinking a little bit in very diffuse terms about sort of thinking about it as a potential future project.
That's all.
Thank you, Alex. Well, Asheesh, it's a fabulous project. You write about it and speak about it with great interest, and we'll all await the publications as they continue to emerge from it. Normally we would have a lunch and a nice round of applause for you, but I'm afraid in the current dispensation, it falls to me to thank you on behalf of the whole group. And
thank you so much to everyone. I really appreciate your time and your engagement. And hopefully at some point, maybe at an NACBS, we'll all have a drink.
Yes, excellent. All right. Bye, folks.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much. It was a wonderful paper, a great presentation.
Thanks.
Project.